Hello everyone and welcome to my Feral PvP guide. This guide will cover the basics of the talent tree, glyphs, macros, rotations, and reforging and gemming gear. This is a basic talent tree for PvP ferals in Arena. In the first set, you typically want to choose Wild Charge over Displacer Beast and Feline Swiftness. Wild Charge has and always will be our gap closer when chasing down targets. It's also great for rooting targets in Arena when used in bear form. A good example is when a Death Knight uses anti-magic shield. Bear form Wild Charge roots a target, but the root counts as physical, so the DK isn't immune to it. It can also be used as a short distance leap if you need to get out of a fight in travel form. Displacer Beast is also great for keeping up with mages and other classes in Arena, but the cooldown is what keeps me from using it. In addition to Prowl being changed on it to a 50% movement speed for 4 seconds, it's really not worth it for Feral, but is still a viable choice for resto druids. Lastly is Feline Swiftness, and there's really no use for this talent anymore for Feral druids since it no longer stacks with the 15% bonus from our PvP set. In the second set, there's 3 different healing skills you can choose from. You would typically want to choose Nature's Swiftness for the extra heal you can pull off with it, and for the instant CCs with Cyclone. However, Feral Druid Cyclone now has a 20-second cooldown 5.2, making this choice a little less wanted, although it's still great. The next skill is Renewal, which is just a 30% heal every 2 minutes. Although not seemingly as great since it's just a heal, it can be macroed in combination with Might of Urzok for a massive health bonus, since the 30% health bonus you get from Might of Urzok stays, unlike Rallying Cry. Next is Cenarion Ward. This is a really nice skill, with the recent buff increasing the healing done from it by 100%, although you typically wouldn't want to choose it over Renewal or Nature's Swiftness, because the healing from it still isn't great unless you spec into Heart of the Wild. In the third set, there's really not a lot of selection here. Typically you want to run with Typhoon though, since it can interrupt casts and knock players off of high areas to line of sight them from their teammates. I never found Fairy Swarm useful since all it does is slow the movement speed of the target by 50%. And you already have Mangle or Shred doing that normally with infected wounds. And with the recent changes to arena maps in 5.3, Mass Entanglement might be a viable choice for Feral Druids since players will now have more ways to get back up top certain maps. In the fourth set, Incarnation is really the only viable option for Feral Druids. Soul of the Harvest and Force of Nature seem more orientated towards sustained damage, whereas Incarnation in combination with Berserk is orientated more towards burst damage. Incarnation is also great for CC since you're able to pounce whenever you want while it's up. You can also stealth if you need to get pressure off if you're being targeted, or to dodge an offensive spell and CC abilities. In the fifth set, there's really 2 skills you should worry about choosing between: Disorienting Roar and Mighty Bash. Disorienting Roar is really useful, and you would most likely choose it against caster Glyphs just to have the extra interrupt for when they're casting spells. But I prefer using Mighty Bash, and for some time I was torn between these two when it came to what was better. Mighty Bash is more for single targets and possibly one of the most offensive CCs in this tree. It's great for chaining into an instant Cyclone or any other CC from your team depending on what comps you're running. And unlike Kata and earlier, Bash is now usable in cap form. In the last set, there's 3 different skills you can choose from, but I personally found Nature's Vigil to be the most useful from them all, especially since the change in 5.2. It's not only reduced in damage from 20% to 10, but the cooldown was cut in half. A lot of people think of this as a nerf because 10% is a lot, but if you think about it, it's more of a buff. The reason behind this is the shorter cooldown and the bonus 25% healing from damage. What this means is you can now use this cooldown in combination with the PvP trinket to get off a little extra burst in between Berserk and Incarnation cooldowns. Other than that, you would go with Heart of the Wild. The extra 6% stats from it are nice and raises Feral sustain damage just a little bit higher, but your burst suffers significantly due to not having Nature's Vigil. However, when using this skill it greatly increases your healing with all resto skills. I would disregard choosing it though since coming 5.3 Battle Fatigue is being changed from 30% to 50%. This on top of Mortal Wounds would leave you at a total of 75% reduced healing. Now that we got the talents out of the way, let's talk about Glyphs. Glyph of Barkskin is one of the best defensive glyphs you can choose. It reduces the crit chance opponents have against you, and it's useful against things like mages that deep freeze, rogues when shadow dancing, and warriors that use recklessness. Next glyph is the Glyph of Cat Form. It's a really nice glyph to have though since it eases healing for your healers. It's also a way to reduce the effectiveness of mortal wounds. Lastly is the Glyph of Savagery, which is pretty much a personal choice for me. There's still a few other choices you can choose aside from this glyph, like the glyph of Pounce or Prowl, but I choose this glyph because it can be used to increase your opener damage by an extra 30%. Feral Druids are one of the most macro heavy classes, and I do have a few macros that will hopefully improve your arena play. First up is my macro for using Shred and Ravage. What this macro does is cast Ravage and the instant proc Ravage us Ferals get out of our tier bonus, but it also casts Shred whenever Ravage is down. It can also be used to spam Ravage when Incarnation is used, and as a bonus I added a Shift modifier to it to also cast Rake whenever Shift is held down. Next is a Power Shift macro, which every Feral should have. It's a simple and effective way to get out of any roots and snares you might be in, but I went further and made it shift you into cat form if you're not in any other form to power shift out of. Ferals actually use a lot of macros, so for most of my other macros I'll post them in the description of this video. Feral Druids don't really have a set rotation because everything they do is very situational, but the opener I use should go something like this. Start out with Savage Roar to get the extra 30% increase to damage, then Rake, Fairy Fire, Shred to 5 combo points, Rip, Rake, Savage Roar to refresh, then build combo points for a 5-point Savage Roar or Maim. The reason I don't open with Pounce is so it doesn't DR with Mighty Bash or Maim. And like I said before, Feral rotations are very situational. When it comes to something like a Priest or a Lock, I would advise opening with Pounce so you could at least get off your full rotation before they have a chance to fear you. Alternatively, you could also use the same opener, but with Nature's Vigil, and your DPS trinket proc. Since the cooldown is short on both, you can have your full burst up in 1 minute and 30 seconds. For gear you want to reforge to mastery after capping your hidden expertise at 3%, and if you can't reforge to mastery, your secondary stat should be crit. I'll link my armory in the description so you can generally see how a feral would reforge. And lastly, gem and gear. The professions I would recommend for feral PvP would be blacksmithing for the extra 2 gem slots, and jewel crafting for the JC only gems. The gems you want for all red slots would be Lucent Vermilion Onyx, and 2 of those can be Lucent Serpent's Eye if you're a jewel crafter. All blue slots should be Vivid Wild Jades for the inclusion of both PvP power and resilience on these gems. And all your yellow and prismatic gem slots should be set to Mystic Sun's Radiance. You're probably wondering why all these gems I chose for the slots offer so much resilience as opposed to other choices you can choose. Feral is a very squishy class, and I've messed around with other gems and slots, but because of the way resilience scales, it's still one of the main stats you should prioritize when gemming. That's it for now on this Feral PvP guide. I hope I've helped you out, and good luck to all of you out there in arenas.